This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture. This is Joël, and welcome to the Sonic Ventures podcast, Season 3, Episode 2. In this episode, we discussed Beyonce's 2016 album, Lemonade. This conversation was recorded on February 9th, 2024. I learned a lot in this conversation. First and foremost about Beyonce. Up until listening to this album and getting ready for the conversation, I knew very little about her or her music. Because we were talking about this album, there was a couple of places that Rob and I went to in our conversation that we had never really encountered in any other conversation about any of their albums in the podcast. And what I felt of that was that we were really able to begin to add to some of the vocabulary, but also the concepts that would serve and will serve other conversations we'll have for other albums. Of course, I don't know what albums those will be, but talking about Lemonade certainly put us in some new territory of talking about music, creativity, collaboration, and even the intention of an artist and their work. Now, along with this, I also wanted to amend something that I said in the aftercast. Now, for those of you who don't know, our aftercasts are continuation conversations that we have. So we record the episode, we take a break, and then we press record again, and we continue our conversation. And those are our aftercasts. And those conversations are always different from what you'll find in an episode, because we're able to sometimes venture deeper into areas that we didn't have time for in the episode itself. And it also lends us to sometimes go into areas that just come with a long form conversation. You can go to places you wouldn't normally go. So in the aftercast for Lemonade, there was a moment where Rob asked me a very direct question about the album. And I answered it, and I'm not going to give that away here. But one of the things I said with my response was that I didn't need to listen to the album again. I felt that I had really taken it in. I'd listened to it many, many times. And in fact, if you named a track right now, I can hear the music and the lyrics immediately. So I didn't feel like I needed to listen to it anymore. However, a couple of days ago, Rob and I decided what our next album would be, what our next conversation would be about. And after us choosing that album, I realized that there was actually some connecting points between Beyonce's Lemonade and the next album we're going to talk about. Some of them a little direct, and some of them rather indirect. But what it had me realize is that it would actually be helpful for me to listen to this album again, not only to support our conversation for this next album, but also because there were some things that we talked about in our conversation that had changed my perception a little bit about this album. And so I'm going to listen to it again. I just wanted to amend that. So now, without further ado, here is our conversation about Beyonce's Lemonade. Thanks for listening.
Well, welcome, Joël, to my humble abode.
Thank you again. It's nice. This time there's a little ambiance with the lighting. I like that.
Thank you very much. I worked very hard on that.
Well, it is a change, and I think it will add to the overall course of the conversation in some respect.
Yeah. I'm a little bit out of our budget for like a smoke machine at this point in time, but
I've always kind of found those a little. They're more exciting in your imagination than what actually happens, unless you go and you really pay the money.
Yeah, if you get a premium smoke machine, that's money.
But otherwise, it's
if you have anemic smoke and
you might as well just use like aromatherapy. Like it's pretty much the same. the same kind of clouds are formed. So yes, nice. It's so nice to be back here again, and for our conversation today about Beyonce's Lemonade.
Yeah.
Her 2016 album. And I was thinking, before we actually get specifically into the album,
sure,
we just touch base on a conversation we had maybe about 10 days ago.
All right, okay.
Because it definitely relates to this album, because it was about this album, but it also relates to the podcast in general.
Okay.
And it was when we just got in touch with one another, and the question came up about whether you were asking me if I was going to watch the visual album, the movie that coincides with this album.
Yeah.
And the reason why I just wanted to bring it up is because I think it's relative. It's really relative to our process for this podcast in general.
Sure.
And so really the question is, you were asking me if I was going to watch the album.
Yes.
And to put it in a more general context, was I going to do anything more aside from listen to the album? And so we talked about that. And so I just thought it would be really good for us just to kind of touch on that a bit here. Right. Because at the time, what I had said to you is that for me, this podcast, the number one thing is just the experience of listening to the album.
Right.
And then anything that might be extra to that, even though it's literally a part of the album or it's indirectly referenced in the album, that's up to our own discretion if we want to engage with those things. So that was where I was with it. And I think we kind of came to a consensus around that. Are you still there with that?
Yeah.
Thinking about it?
Oh yeah. Like you, for me, the prime experience here and the thing that I'm primarily interested in exploring is the album.
Right.
As a thing. Mm-hmm. But of course the album connects and opens doors, much like our conversations, to other things.
Right. Yeah.
So, in my own preparation, I definitely do follow those threads of thought and interest as they so capture me during my listening experiences. Mm-hmm. And that will include, we'll call it ancillaries or paratext even, things related to the album that may even in some ways be part of a larger experience of the album, officially or unofficially, but the decision to go down those isn't an automatic one. It's something I'll do as I follow my mood.
So yeah, it's based on your mood and based on the album.
Yeah, based on the mood in the album. So for me on this one, of course, I was exposed to some of these visuals and some of the conversations about the visuals.
Right.
That will have encountered sort of in the culture at large.
Right.
Because there's no way to really navigate through the ideas and topics and the press of this album without sort of encountering those.
Yeah.
But I tended on this one to veer away a bit from those.
Okay.
I saw what I wanted to see.
Right.
And I answered the questions of what those were, I think, well enough to sort of keep me somewhat informed as I continued to listen to the album and accrue more listens.
Right.
So
So it's the same thing for me. The example I like to give from a previous album we did is Hounds of Love, Kate Bush. And there was a track that she based on a book by Peter Reich. And I actually went ahead and read the book.
Right. I remember.
So that was, and that was something we explored, I think, more in the aftercast of that episode, which is available through the regular podcast streaming.
That was one of our aftercast. I think our first aftercast.
Yeah, and it was the one we've put out so that people can get a sense of the aftercast. And so if they want to hear more of a conversation, they can go to our Patreon and hear the other aftercasts. But that one, I really wanted to read that book. Like, that book had been on my mind off and on for years. And so the opportunity was just in my face that now is more than ever is a good time to read this book.
Now's the time. The door had been opened and you had momentum.
A couple of doors more than usual. Before it was just, I want to read the book. But now it had this, conversational impetus to do that. So I think that that is how we've been operating and will continue to go forward, is that really we're going to be talking about our experiences of the album, and our focus is on the album, even though there might be other parts, other media or other extensions of that experience that we'll bring into the mix. But it is really about the conversation about the album that is bringing us here, and that is like the spine of the conversation.
Yeah, well said.
Thank you.
Said, yeah.
Well, I thought about it a little bit.
Yeah, as you do.
So, Lemonade.
Yeah. Now here's something I suddenly thought of, and Joël often likes to, I don't want to say sandbag me, but he likes to lay a very big, broad question on me.
Yes, I believe in surprises.
Yeah, in surprises. Like, I was wondering, what's your complete take on this album? So just sort of opening the door to, so I have no idea what you've got in store today in terms of the things that you've been thinking about and questions. But, this album happened sort of at a place in time in culture, 2016, correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of what was going on then? And
okay. No. And basically what I did was I didn't do that.
Okay.
If anything, though, well, maybe no is not quite accurate. I had sense in terms of the collaborative elements she brought into the album.
Yeah.
So that is where I had some reference there.
Right.
But for most of the albums we've done, I haven't done that.
Yeah.
I haven't said, okay, what are all the albums that came out in 2016? I'm popping my piece here. I purposefully kept the album kind of in something of a world of its own.
Okay.
Because of how much he's a part of the pop zeitgeist. I decided that I didn't want to engineer my experience of the album through too many lenses, even though I knew I was going to find them. I was going to run into them. And I did that for a couple of reasons. The first reason is partially as an exercise for the album itself. I guess one way to look at it was I wanted to treat it like I found it on a shelf somewhere, like 50 years from now, and there was nothing else around it to put it in my way other than the fact that it was there, and I just put it on and I listened to it.
Right.
And the other reason is because of my own limited knowledge of her and her work and where I already was with that. Because I have had some people around me have opinion about her work and her presence as an artist. And I wanted to let the album, as much as I could, let the album stand on its own.
Right.
So then work back from there. Because then eventually I'm going to learn other things and it's going to grow. But the very first listen, I really wanted it to be just me and the album as best I could curate as possible. Yeah. So for what was going on in 2016, I do know that pop was not happening like this. I do know that albums were not being created with this in the realm of, let's just say, the bandwidth of possibilities where Beyonce's work lives. Artists weren't making albums like this. With that's a very important element to this album, is that every track really harkens to some distinct genre. Like it doesn't hit, of course, all of them,
Right.
but it hits some very clear it works from some very clear distinctions.
Sure.
So when I actually heard the album for the first time, I was actually pleased that I didn't really know that about the album until I first heard it. Like the only thing I knew was that it was about infidelity in her relationship with Jay-Z. And I knew that the whole album was about that.
Yeah.
And that was it. The moment I read that, I engaged with that, I just turned everything off.
Right.
You know, it was like radio silence as best I could.
Right. You wanted to let it unfold and get that experience of sort of virgin ears on first listen, virgin mind.
As best I could.
Yeah.
Which I know is not possible.
Right.
But
Yeah.
but in terms of, I really felt that it was for the benefit of what we're doing, and then also for the benefit of the work itself. Like, just to the best I could, just hold it apart from all the other things that happens with it.
Yeah.
And so again, back to what was going on at that time. In 2016, there's all, where we are with music right now is in a place that's unlike the one that you and I grew up with.
Sure.
Where there were very narrow bandwidths of engagement, and you were starved to get information. You were always hungry.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's the opposite. You're dodging buffet tables of information all the time. Mm-hmm. So I think for the case of what was going on musically in 2016, I think now that you've asked me this question, I'm actually glad you asked me this question, because there's a lot of ways to talk about that, especially with where we are with streaming and with the sub possibilities of engaging with music. But I think at the same time, Beyonce is an institution. And when I say that, I don't mean that she's literally on her own. But I think that I was more actually, along with not really seeing what else was going on at the time, I also didn't want to engage with any of her other albums. So I really put this album
focused.
Yeah, I really kept it focused right at first.
Right.
Especially that first listen. Yeah. Which was done on a walk. Which I like to do with all the albums the first time. I tend to take them for a walk. And it was a very dark morning that I was listening to this album. So
dark in terms of
like
of
literally,
light
because I was out the door by 7:00 in the morning, and in BC at this time of year, it was still a month ago. It was darker in the morning than it is now.
Yeah.
So I walked with this album in a very dark mood the first time, which I thought was very complimentary to some of what I engaged with in the album at first. Yeah. Right. So that was how I began the process. And I also, early on, I think actually, I should say, I also knew that there was a movie, like a film, a visual album, as she puts it. So I knew that I would be engaging with that. That I also knew I would do, but I didn't engage with any of it. It was the album first. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you mentioned a couple things that really jump out on this album that I'm sure we're going to talk about here. One is the different genres of music. The different sounds that or styles that are very, very specifically different from each other that are part of this album. So this question of homogeneousness versus collage or pastiche or
sweet, as it's sometimes referred to.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. You could definitely do that. That's definitely interesting. So, were you saying you were drawn to that right away?
Oh, okay. I see.
When you first encountered that mix,
okay,
did it pull you in, or did it sort of
that was the thing that pulled me in the most?
Okay.
So, just to give you the full spectrum of that first experience, what I was left with was a bifurcation in that the one hand was all these tracks, as we've said, are stemming from different genres, and they all have different palettes. So there's a lot of variety to a certain degree on this album in that respect. So that was the first thing that drew me in to the album. But what didn't draw me in was her voice. And after I finished listening to the album, I wouldn't say that I set upon myself to voraciously solve this, but her voice didn't move me. I was not gripped. I was not taken in by her voice, and I didn't know why. And so a part of my process, which perhaps we'll get to, is for this album was learning about that. Why is it that first listen, I had that feeling about her voice, but I didn't have that feeling about the whole album? Because the other thing that was very clear, which there's a couple of things about this album I do appreciate. And one of them is that the focus of the content, there's a very clear arc that she maps through the tracks and the lyrics of how the album is based on what's the name of that? The stages of grief. So the album is based on the Kubler-Ross model of grief. But there's more parts, right? There's 12 tracks, and so there's more segments to that. And when I listened to the album, that through line was very strong. Like that for sure was evident to me. It was most evident in the lyrics. But the sound of her voice and the way that she was singing I didn't get grabbed at any moment.
Right.
So that the differences in the tracks, like I said, the palette, the feels, that stuck out for me. And that gave me a level of engagement. But what I was left with was also, why do I feel this way about her voice?
Right. And by voice, you're specifically talking to the sonic of her voice, like her actual, the singing.
Actually,
I'm in contrast to the abstract or conceptual element of her voice in, we'll call it quotation marks. Like what voice are you talking about there?
Well, because I wasn't sure, I went as broad as possible.
Okay.
Like I thought of it in terms of, is it the notes and the rhythms, or am I feeling something into the window of her soul? Like, I was very broad with it.
Okay.
Is it not reaching me because she herself is not reaching deep enough within herself? Or is it just her rhythmic choices? Or is it the vocal line? Or is it the way that the voice has been manipulated? Because that's another important component in all vocals now, is I don't think anybody doesn't tweak their vocals with autotuner or some other kind of wave manipulation or that. So is it maybe the production of her voice, right? So I left it completely open.
Okay.
Very open, yeah.
Yeah, we'll circle back to that because I'm going to say there's one obvious exception on this album in particular where the voice is not treated and manipulated in the way we would maybe naturally assume it to be. But we'll get there.
Okay. So what was your first experience with this album?
Like you, I took some time to isolate and listen to this on its own. And And so for me, that usually means a drive. I have maybe a 30-minute, 35-minute drive window every morning when I leave my house to go to work. And it's funny, as we get deeper or longer into the album selections, and we get more albums that come from the post CD or the CD on age onward, the length of albums get bigger, And so there are some albums that 35-minute or 30-minute drive, you can play the whole album.
Right.
But as we get, into like the CD era and beyond, you can maybe play 2/3 of the album.
Right.
And so my first listen was 2/3 of the album.
Oh, okay.
On the trip to work. And I noted a few things right away. I noted sort of just the multiple voices on the album of contributors and through style, and sort of initially what I'll say on that first listen experience, sort of not so much as a lack of cohesion, but an obviousness of like there's a whole lot of cooks in this, and I can hear it.
Yeah.
It's not a whole lot of cooks that created a wonderful, homogeneous stew or something. It's like being served a restaurant meal of multiple dishes, but each course is done by a different chef in a different style,
in different restaurant, in a different country. Yeah, I noticed that too.
Yeah, and and that's not a comment to note that it's not a comment on what I think about that as a good or bad thing at this point, but it was the first impression of that. It's like, it's a little bit schizoid in that sense. There's an element of, I knew my work was going to be cut out to bring this together as a listener. Like the challenge was definitely to reconcile the experience of that first listen and that initial observation of all those voices and all those hands, and find my way into the album as a thing.
Yeah.
Right? So, at first it resists thingness in a way.
Okay.
It's sort of, so that was my initial experience of just like, okay, this isn't going to be so easy.
Right.
I'm going to have to find a way to make sense.
Well,
all these voices.
I never did. Like, I don't think I have. Like, if that was a major reason to determine whether I would be ready to talk about this album or not, I would need another few months to really find out how all of that works and fits together. And I probably wouldn't figure it all out anyway.
Well, for me, it wasn't the academic element of how it fit together, but just the how it is, how I'm going to make sense of this. Like finding, like, how am I going to find my way to Beyonce's Lemonade as opposed to this?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Because and in some ways, that is the question of the album for me. And that's the journey.
Right.
How do we find Beyonce's Lemonade in Beyonce's Lemonade?
Right. Yeah.
And that's not to say that there's a specific destination to find, and that there's only one way to get there.
Right.
And whether you find it or don't find it, or whether you think it's there or it's not there, is somehow a summation of the artistic achievement of this. It's but it is part of our journey, right? It's part of the journey to explore music. So the fact that question is on the table isn't a good or bad commentary.
No. And actually it kind of pairs into what we've talked about with a few other albums, which is in the same realm as the reliable narrator. And finding some clarity as to that question of what is going on here.
Yeah.
And what is maybe kind of taking you off track or sending you deeper into understanding that.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of process and how this album was recorded, you alluded to it very funnily in the different countries, different,
Right.
there's something this album shares with Queensryche. Queensryche.
Yeah.
That it, as a project, it had a scope to it and a big narrative.
Yeah.
And it was storyboarded.
Yeah.
Whether it was at a studio in Quebec or, at an apartment first in Seattle,
right,
and then a studio in Quebec, this album itself underwent a similar process. So,
right.
there's, and I found that the two contrasts and the comparison between the two kind of an interesting thing, because unlike, say, our understanding of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, where it was workshopped through live performance.
Yeah.
So it grew in a virtual storyboard, I guess you could say, through live performance. So it underwent a process. So when you storyboard a novel or you storyboard a film, that process is very similar, and but it's a way of visually organizing,
right,
and sort of being able to see your project sort of in its totality as you add elements to it, and create that. As an author, and having been in your studio, in your workshop,
right,
I've seen evidence of your own storyboarding.
Yep.
And so I thought that it would be interesting to sort of get a sense where, as you listen to this album, and the Queensryche album as well, do you see or can you hear a difference between a storyboarded album in this way or something that evolved, say, through the Dark Side of the Moon process? Is there something? Are
you asking me that question, or are you throwing it out there?
Well, I'm asking you the question, but it's also rhetorical too. But is there an artifact to that process that we can detect in?
Well, look at Tyler the Creator's album, Igor. There was no storyboard. He just got up every day for a number of days and then realized what was going on. And I think the arc is pretty clear in that album. So I would say I think it's based on just the album and what we get to know of it.
Yeah.
Even I'm curious about how you talked about the way the voice was treated. You probably found some things I didn't find. And so in the same respect of that, look at an album like Queensryche, or not Queensryche, King's X.
Yeah.
And how there was no storyboard.
Right.
And apparently there's probably no concept, but one of them wrote out the concept.
Yeah.
That happened for them and all of that. And so that's really, really clear.
Right.
How about something like Deltron 3030? How storyboarded was that? I didn't think I really found that out. I also didn't really seek it. Yeah. But it sounds like it really was. It's so visual. It just comes up in your mind so easily with all the not only the words that are used, but also just how it has a very clear through line.
Right.
So I think it's possible for those through lines to evolve on their own. I think it just depends on how it happened.
Yeah.
So I don't think you can know for sure. But when I listened to this album for the first time and could clearly hear that process, I suspected it.
Right.
And sure enough, it was the case.
Yeah.
And I think that just the sheer number of people who contributed to this album, that is also, it's not only something that an individual would use to keep a cohesion with what they're doing, but it's also the way you keep an enterprise functioning is if you have so many hands or so many minds engaged with what's going on, you can be greatly benefited by having an external guide.
Right.
Like that. Like, no, this is where things are going and this is how it's going to fit together.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
but in terms of hearing it, I don't think so.
Nothing, no artifacts from that.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So that leads to something that you also said earlier too. You talked about Beyonce and then as an institution, and I almost thought you were about to make the distinction between Beyonce and Beyonce Inc.
Oh,
right.
Oh, I didn't even think about it that way.
There's, certainly within this album, there's examples of Beyonce and Beyonce Inc. On the album credits. Beyonce is listed as executive producer.
Right.
And in different interviews and write-ups about the album, you'll have some of her collaborators, some of the artists that were brought in to participate here, very much commented about her participation and how impressed they were with her management of the process. And now, of course, that could all be hyperbole as well, because, there's the next album that you might get the call in for to participate in as well. And these things are very lucrative. So it's a business, right?
Yeah.
And there's always a certain mythologizing involved in that process of marketing albums and different things. And but at the same time, I think we could take that at face value that, despite executive producer often being a vanity title, it can also, especially in film,
yes,
that Beyonce definitely, not just Beyonce Inc., her people, but she herself was participated as sort of overseer or project director to a certain degree, within this. I think we can take that at face value.
Well, when I refer to as an institution, it's good for me to clarify what I mean by that, because I think, first of all, she is the CEO and head of that company, Parkwood, and I don't doubt that it's a very hands-on process that she went through with this album. While also being the head of a company that has a lot of branches. It goes to a lot of places. Yeah. It has a lot of interests and connections. And part of the reason why I referred to her as an institution is partially from what you just said, is that there are very many levels to what we simplify in referring to as the music industry.
Right.
There are people whose livelihood is based on just writing songs and hoping or working to get them picked up by somebody who has some clout, who has means, like Beyonce, and that if they get their work, their name on her album, it's going to affect their lives. It's going to affect their livelihood. Yeah, yeah. And so to be on a Beyonce album is not just it's not just about that. It's about what it can lead to. And she actually is pretty clear about it in the last song, Formation. When she says, I can get your song on the radio. Right. She's not, the thing about that isn't boasting. I don't think that's boasting at all. Right. So my referring to her as an institution, like you were speaking of a couple of things about the album, I think these are just the state of things. Yeah. And she's there because she wants to be there. And she's there because she can. Her parents, I would find it very hard to believe that her parents' influence on her wasn't only in them raising her as a child, but seeing them as entrepreneurs and philanthropists. Her father was the manager of Destiny's Child. Yeah. Her mom is a business owner of her own. And I think that she wasn't only influenced by Michael Jackson and Madonna for the fact of them singing and dancing. I think she saw herself in the role that she is in.
Yeah.
Like she's manifested it. I don't doubt that. But I also believe, not to go too far off course here, her hands were very much all over this. I think so. I do have an image to characterize this album for myself, which I'll get to later.
Okay.
But because it's very symbolic and all of that stuff.
Okay.
But there's an intimacy about this album. There's a vulnerability about the content of this album, and even if, no matter how much we can understand how, I can't think of a better word, but how genuine that is.
Yeah.
I can't see how the focus of that, and that she will be presenting this, would end up being encouraged and put together and sustained by all these people that are around her and that she's working with. She made that be the position for herself to be in when she made this album and when she shot those visuals for the visual album, for the film.
Right. And again, from your participation in the film industry, film is very much unapologetically a collaborative process. Outside of pure auteurism,
right? Which is it's that's a whole other.
It's just
it's a huge conversation.
Right. There's air quotes being said and all this stuff and sort of winks, but the the scale of this kind of project isn't delegitimized, or the end product isn't delegitimized by the fact that it was produced through this large endeavor.
Right.
We have this sort of, we like to naively reduce this idea that for the art to be pure and the music to be pure, it has to come from a guy in a bedroom or on a coffee house stage with a guitar, and as a singer-songwriter, working through these wonderful songs and creating this music. That's the only way to legitimize a work of music or work of art that way.
Yeah, and I'd say it's even more complicated to talk about than what you've characterized. I think even what you've characterized as denoting it as simplification is even greater simplification. You're right, because it's that idea of the fractal unfolding, right? Where we and how we balance the individual and the group idea, or the singular and the plural.
Sure, and where it gets important to kind of notate this is that there are people that will immediately look for ways to criticize this, or to delegitimize the end product and say, well, she didn't write this, or she didn't do this, or it didn't come from this place, and that's a trope unto itself. That kind of response to this.
It is, and so basically it's an evolving process for us as a species in relationship to our creativity.
Yeah,
because you could even go so far as to say you can't do anything by yourself,
right?
Because even that guy or that person in their bedroom writing those songs, they didn't farm and prepare all the food that they've consumed during that time. They didn't keep the electrical grid going. They didn't make the furniture in their apartment. They probably didn't even make that. They didn't make that guitar. They didn't wind the strings. I mean, you can spin that all kinds of different ways.
Right.
So then we come back to the reliable narrator. And what you said before is, where is Beyonce's lemonade in this lemonade?
Yeah. Oh, and you know what? Especially if you phrase it on reliable narrator terms, I was thinking initially just more like, where is the heart of her experience in this, or where's her album? But also, if you Beyonce certainly had an experience of some kind related to Jay-Z and whatever went on.
Okay, I think
right?
Yeah.
Now, so there's that something happened,
Yes.
and that inspired partly this work of art, right? And so then there's a question within the work of art is, how much of that experience is part of this work of art? Did it even happen?
Well, and
does it matter?
What I also thought about is, when did the album come into its creation in relationship to this event?
Yeah, exactly.
So how were these songs created while things were going on, or was it all conceived of well after things had happened and then things had been worked through, or had been like, did she write, did formation come into formation when that formation was happening, right? The last song of the album, where there's that tenor and tone of I'm better than okay, and there's a lot of empowering imagery and concepts in it. There's areas which you could say are boastful, or they're literal.
Yeah, there's
but did that happen? Did that song happen when that was happening, or did it happen well after the whole arc? Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, yeah. I'm. It's funny as we have this conversation. I'm asking myself, do I open this door now, and do we try and unpack this here now? Or is that aftercast? Is that something we do in the aftercast? Because there's this personal narrative, right? And there's this personal history that is part of the story of this album,
right?
And then of course there's a reframing or a framing of this as a sort of a telling of the Black experience of a larger sort of
generational trauma,
generational trauma, which itself is a neat way. It's its own sort of narrative work, right?
Yeah.
And so the. And that exercise of that is itself open to criticism, or open to its own journey. Even it could be its own discussion, just on just the mechanics of that, because we often in our personal experiences of things, it's a natural thing to kind of reframe them in a bigger narrative, or a different, or a symbolic narrative.
Okay,
right? Because we looked at the power of symbols and symbology, and the historicity of human experience to kind of frame ourselves within a master narrative, right? So you have this very, very small, very human experience,
right?
That sometimes to escape the personal the personal wound of that, or the individual specified or specificity of that experience,
right?
Reframing it as part of a larger narrative, or a more universal narrative, or as giving it another context. Recontextualizing is probably the better word,
right?
To escape, avoid, transcend,
right,
from that personal into something that you then can rewrite yourself into the world, or back into the world.
Right. I see what you're saying.
Right. So I've done this with my own traumas.
Okay.
So we're finding your way through them, because ultimately we're talking about surviving a trauma.
Yeah.
And the terms in which you will resurface and re-articulate and reorder your world and your understanding of the world in the context of the trauma you experienced, and in the context of how you are going to remember or carry that into the future.
Okay.
So Beyonce chose a very grand vision for that, a very grand sort of master narrative, and which I find very interesting. And it's not a question of that it's true or not true, or but I just found that process very, very full.
What do you mean? Which process? Like, are you talking about
taking the personal,
right,
and then reframing it into sort of a master narrative, or a larger recontextualizing it into part of a larger art.
So you found that you're just stating how you said it was full. So you're saying that you're talking about what she did is something that is a very common thing for people to do, which is to reorient themselves in their sense of being, which is that I've had this thing happen to me. How does that thing relate to me? And by extension, how do I relate to everything else? And then you're able to continue on from there. So you're just talking about how, if I understand what you're saying, is that her process was to take something very personal and recast it in a larger context so that she could move forward from it. Because you're not actually criticizing, you're not saying whether this is good or bad.
Right.
You're just explaining
just the process. But also, then I'm also sort of getting back into the question of narration, right? You know, that not only is there, like, yes, there's the question of reliable narrator and what the narration of an event is, but then there's the way we narrate and create our reality through narrative for ourselves, right?
Right.
So, you know, for me to understand or describe, we'll call it my trauma through a relationship that involved cheating from someone, you know, I have a way I speak of that. And I have a narrative that I've constructed that's part of that. Now, in my narrative, unfortunately, I don't have a cadre of marching soldiers, shoulder to shoulder with me, sort of helping me sort of ascend back into the world.
Right.
But I created my own contextualized narration to sort of allow me to sort of move forward with a sense of what that was.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And my narration may or may not be true or wholly true, or, you know, I think it's all...
it's your side of the story, how it's often put. It's it's not only from your perspective, but it's also from what that perspective has access to and is able to utilize.
Right.
So in Beyonce's case, she has loads of resources at her disposal.
Sure.
To implement if she wanted to. She didn't have to do this.
Right.
She could have just kept it on the low, because her life, I mean, as far as I've learned from what I've learned about her, she's actually she really cares for her privacy. You know, I was actually, it's not quite the same thing, but it was reminding me a little bit of what I've always heard about Bob Dylan, of how he's really maintained his privacy and how he cares for it. Now, of course, he doesn't have the same kind of career, or he didn't come through the same time period and situations and context that Beyonce would go through. But one of the things I heard a number of people say very enthusiastically is, this is the most we've ever learned about her. And so I got that feeling from people who really admire her work or feel that they've gained from it. They felt like, it seemed to me, they felt like she gave them more of herself than she ever has. And I actually read a couple articles of people talking about what the album means to them. And what I found very compelling about that was how they all had different ways of using the album for themselves. Just as you've talked about her having this experience and then, or talking about yourself and working through something where you have to reorient yourself. So your sense of scale, your sense of place, your sense of rhythm and time has to be addressed so that in these personal views of the album, there were women talking about how it helped them through something that had nothing to do with infidelity. But because they're a woman, or they're a woman of color, or that they're in business, there was a variety of things that came out of that.
Yeah.
And I think that these kinds of experiences, like an experience like betrayal, in the English language, when you use the word betrayal around some people, it hits home very quickly. And one way I think to think about betrayal is that it's very much like, by way of analogy, the spaceship you're in is falling apart. And how do you save the environment that keeps you alive? You have to deal with first principles when someone, at least from my personal experiences with it, or what I've learned from other people, you go to first principles. You don't even want to get up in the morning and eat. You don't even want to get out of bed. And so the need to reorient ourselves and recharacterize elements of our narrative or our view or whatever is about first principles. And what I love about what you're bringing up, which can be about this album, but can be about a whole lot of other things, is it also demonstrates how important symbolism is. And how symbolism is inextricably connected to first principles of life for human beings. How you view yourself and where you are is highly symbolic. I personally find the way people will talk about rationality to be highly symbolic, or how they use rationality is very symbolic. So in terms of this album, and in terms of what I read of how it was mostly women, what it meant for them is that the album itself gave them a metric for a moment or a time in their life. And I think that is also included in why I referred to her as an institution. And she has to, like any celebrity, she has to contend with how other people create things about her. Right? She's this. She didn't call herself Queen Bee. Other people call her that. Now, whether she likes it or not, or approves it, I have no idea. But the way that you've brought up, I just really appreciate the way you've brought up symbolism into this and the creative aspect of it, and how
a little clumsily, though.
No, I don't think, no, because you in your own way, you have your way of expressing yourself, which has, in my estimation, has a virtuosity about it. And the virtuosity of what I think you have as you've characterized this is that you are very equally looking at it in that personal sense and that broader sense. But what I was going to get to about the creative stuff and the symbolic stuff, it's just like digging a hole in the sand. It's not so easily, like you said, reduced to, it's got to be this person alone in their room coming up with the song. That's what makes it a thing. It's like I mentioned in Bob Dylan. It's like the Bob Dylan mythos. That's where real authenticity comes from. I saw an interview with Bob Dylan where he was being asked, why don't you write those songs anymore? And he said, I don't know where they came from. I can't do that. He actually said, I can't do it. He said, it's not me, So I think that also, in a way, for me to spin it, brings us back to the number of people working on this album. And you said, I remember we had one other conversation early on where we touched on this, and you said something like, "Who wrote this album? Like, who made this album?" And when I watched the film, because you didn't watch the whole film, right? You watched a couple.
I watched. Yeah, I didn't watch the whole film.
I watched the whole film, and the one thing that I naively thought when it said, and there's poetry, I thought, oh, we're going to hear some of her poetry. No, that's the poetry of Worcestershire.
Yeah.
So we come to this place that we're finding ourselves more and more, we read about and we attribute it to AI, of recursive behavior, taking two things or three things or four things or 1,000 things, putting them together, and then something else happens.
Right.
And so this album is just, that's what this album, I don't have the familiarity with Beyonce's method for her other albums. I've heard it's the same, so I'm going with that. But this album is so much about amalgamating things and putting things together. Sure, she's got a vision, but even the lists of names on some of these tracks, which some of them just have to do with the sample sources.
Yeah, so you'll have 15 or 18 songwriters, but three of those are samples. They're on there because they sampled something, and
those original writers of the
So ergo, source. We've got Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, and we've got John Paul Jones.
When the Levee Breaks.
Yeah, because we have the drum break or something from.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's an interesting thing, because we've talked before about the dialogic, and that's basically we'll call it the interrelationship between utterances, that no single utterance or expression exists on its own, that it all exists in a universe that has an interrelationship with every other previous utterance and going forward, and you can see examples of this in just the way we treat language. The original Oxford English Dictionary,
the English language.
Part of that dictionary was to document the use of words, right?
Yes.
Like where it was first used, to give the context of its use over time, because it recognizes just the dialogic of language and how things evolve over time. Well, life and music and everything is dialogic. Everything exists in relationship to what has gone on in the past.
Yes.
And especially now we have sort of a meme culture.
Sort of.
The postmodern meta referential
Campbell's soup everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Andy. It is everywhere.
Yeah.
So, whereas there are criticisms of this kind of process of sampling and constructing, borrowing or reinterpreting or interpolating other works, that is just in a way, it's almost like our denial that things weren't that way anyway, through just the genesis of an idea in our head, didn't just come from nowhere. Right. So, whether someone is dropping a sample into a work, or they've hummed up an idea, the relationship between, what came before and the genesis of that idea is the same. In many cases or most cases. But so what that does, though, when it's explicit, as it is in this album, is that those references and the art of bringing those elements together to sort of paint with collage or tableau of all these little references, all these familiar little component elements, it creates its own richness, right? It's part of the art of that. So this isn't, there's an intentionality between the combination of all these little elements.
Right.
That is part of the art. It's not the example of artlessness that people like to sometimes point to when people create this way through pastiche or through collage or through
right. Well, but I think the other word, an idea that comes into the mix of this is intentionality.
Yeah.
What is the intention here?
Yeah.
And so when somebody is which doesn't happen very often, is in a position such as Beyonce seems to be in, you have to wonder, because you can't get there without playing games.
Right.
You can use an analogy for game for everything, but you don't win Grammys because the album is good. You just to get into the position of having a Grammy possibility is its own game. You have to know how it works. You have to know how to play it. Look, I myself, in my modest experiences with the art world here in Vancouver, have seen things and experienced things and been told and suggested things that I never thought would happen at, let's call it, for lack of a better way of putting it, at that level. That I play this game this way just as if I was trying to win an Oscar? You really?
Yeah.
Yes. And so what I may be depicting as a kind of cynicism, I think is more, I'm not being cynical. I'm trying to illustrate that we're trying to learn how to get along. We're trying to learn how to be individuals, but also be part of a collective that we have some little awareness of. Just as you were talking about how, anything you come up with in your mind, you hum or something, it's connected.
Sure.
And how broadly you want to conceive of that implicates how you live your life. There was the whole, just to maybe really get off topic here for a second, the Ed Sheeran case about him being accused of, and the strength of his the strength of his argument was on how the chords he was using, they've been used for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of songs. So you can't copyright G major, but you can copyright a song that carries G major. So the whole idea of how I think we serve ourselves by looking at this, but it doesn't make it any so-called easier, is we don't know what her intentions are. Just as I read about some of the songwriters who ended up on this album, one in particular was talking about how he didn't even know that his song got chosen to be on the album.
That was Father John Misty, right? At first, where he said they let him know at Coachella.
Maybe it was him. So yeah, he didn't. The person that I was reading about.
Yes, I shouldn't have interrupted you.
No, that's fine.
Go ahead.
He didn't know, but he worked on this song with Winter Gordon. And they thought it was completely a Beyonce song. And it wasn't until much later he even found out that it was on the album.
Right.
And so that there's a lot of ways we could talk about this state of creation, or this kind of creation, that you could argue that it's less intimate. And then that's why, and that people don't know. Right? Not everyone's on the same page all the time, right? Beyonce's the captain of that ship, and so she's the one who knows where everything's going to go, but everyone else is just to certain degrees involved in that. And so I could see how people would see that to be inauthentic or question the intention of that.
Right. Well, a lot of this was outsourced in the sense, or tendered, right? So like, think of like a big job, a company doing something, and you got all these sub jobs, and you're tendering component elements of the project to different people. And so we had different artists that either had existing tracks that they found their way into the system.
Yeah.
Others were solicited or tendered,
like Jack White.
Yeah. And oftentimes they were just working with drum beats and rhythms. So, they put together their thing and sent it off, to the mothership, right? And so, but and that mothership, as you pointed out, was studios in this country for a period of time.
Yeah.
And which I imagine is what they're saying is that that the assemblage of the album, sort of was done in a couple of major places in a couple of major points of time. But there was then also bedrooms and studios and of all the individuals that were working on elements of this that were being sent back to, like I said, that sort of mothership location. So, if you really want to have some fun, the question is how many bedrooms and how many studios were actually involved in this process. Hundreds. It's
just an easy number to approximate. Yeah.
And at some point they were probably being filtered and touched at Beyonce's studio at her house, and before they were, going and assembled.
Well, yeah, there's that. Her engineer is like, that's the point where everything is coalesced,
right?
And I think my impression was that she was working with him the most regularly than anyone else,
right? And while this was all going on, the big picture of the album, the release strategy and the visuals and the Super Bowl performance that was part of this, all these things were part of the parallel planning.
Appearing on the Country Music Awards, doing daddy lessons,
we're all part of this. So like the actual project, we're having this discussion about the album, and but the album is just a kernel of the whole project unto itself, where each
so as we have gotten to where we've gotten to, we've barely even come into really talking about the specifics of the album, even of our specific experience of it. I mean, we've touched on it a little bit,
just a little bit, man.
Yeah. But I think but I think what we're talking about is exceedingly valuable.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about something as exactly like what you were talking about with Beyonce, taking that personal experience and putting and contextualizing it in the way that it's presented here, in that it goes into this multi-generational trauma, the sense of being African American or a person of color, and even a woman, like there's these broader contexts that it's all brought into. And what I see and think about with creativity and this, and where human beings are with it right now, and how, look at the situation with Hollywood and the strikes that happened recently. Look at what's being talked about with the music industry, and then look at how we who have our home studios are also subject to similar things that are going on with streaming, or how we disseminate and share our work, or what that work will be. Like, I never thought when I was a teenager that so many people would have multimedia studios in their basements.
Including yourself.
Including myself, putting their stuff out there, and at the once thinking this is great. I was never able to do this before, but the moment I upload it, it's gone into a sea of all these other people uploading things, and now what am I? I'm being asked to compete.
Right.
I'm being asked to actually arm wrestle algorithms that I don't even know how they work. I don't even know how to make them myself. So where we are in this conversation, I feel, is that this album, I think in a big way, which is what has happened for me while I was listening to it, has really facilitated to engage with these, what seem to be issues of industry. They're actually very, very much the groundwork of our concept and manifestation of creativity.
Yeah.
You know, how do you make something? Why do you make it? Who is it for? Like, these kinds of questions are actually just coming up in our faces. It doesn't matter if it's AI. Like, I was watching the other day a conversation Rick Beato had with, what's his name? Session guy. They were talking about the middleman musicians.
Yeah.
Middle class musicians.
Middle class musicians.
Middle class musicians.
Tim Pierce.
Tim Pierce, that's it. I knew there was a Tim in there.
Yeah.
If, for those of you who know, I'm not really great with names. So, even my own. So, they were talking about what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
And in a sense, Beyonce is actually incredibly supportive, depending on how you want to spin this, right, of these people who have these lives writing songs and working in studios.
Right. And I'm going to say, just because I talked about Father John Misty, or his, suddenly I'm going to blank on the pronunciation of his name, Mystery or Misty, Father John Misty.
I'm going to leave it to you.
Yeah. He wrote one of the songs on this album, or he wrote a verse or part of a song on this album. And like a lot of people, that worked on this, there was probably 4 times as many people, I'm just guessing, but certainly there were a lot of people who will have worked on things for consideration for this album that had been left on the cutting room floor, that didn't get on the album, right?
Yeah.
But he talked about the experience of being at Coachella and having Beyonce come up to him and basically say, "Hey, just so you know, you made the cut."
Oh yeah, no, I was talking about someone else.
You were talking about someone, okay. Yeah. So that acknowledgement of, like, Beyonce knows what that means to him, both economically and also just the juice and the thrill of.
Oh, I found it. Father John Misty.
Misty.
Yes,
yeah, for sure.
Father
okay,
John
so
Misty.
I was right when I called him Father John Misty.
You were totally right.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
If only I got to hear that more from my wife.
Wow.
No.
That's aftercast material.
And then she would say, "Well, just be right more often then."
Oh, wow. Okay.
Da-da-da. Yeah, comedy gold. But you can imagine there might have been 100 or 200 people or 300 people on this album that went through this process, that and just that little moment sort of shows, like you say, all those people, she knew what this would mean for each and every one of them. And it is funny because we look at our Dr. Luke Inc. productions of some of the pop music that gets criticized, and in Beato's conversation talking about the loss of that middle class musician, but certainly Beyonce's process seems to open up to more people, opens up the world.
That's a way to spin it, because then the other spin is that because, just to personalize it a little bit, these were the avenues that I was told were open to me that didn't interest me. So the idea in my mind of working as a middle class musician in these regards, of writing songs and hoping that, or trying to get someone to pick it up and all, it's just not me. It's not my way of going about it. And so for some people who have I've talked about this with, they actually would say that it's just a smoothed over corporatization of the creation of music anyways. It's not, so we could say that she's being supportive of something and it's sustaining something that's genuine, but we could also say no.
We also don't know what the terms of those contracts are.
Exactly.
Right. And you can have your name on a song and get little to no points on the song, even if it's mostly your song.
Well, that's what I mean. Again, that's why I referred to it as an institution.
Right.
Because And it doesn't have to be Beyonce. No. Like this kind of, it's just the simple idea of by association.
Yeah.
Something will move. Something will change. You were here and now you're over here. And that's not just about music. That's communal human existence.
Yeah.
If you're with a group of people and they don't think you're pulling your weight, however you want to look at it, whether it's making sure people can eat or it's just, playing those chords right, you're out.
Yeah,
we'll find someone else. Like and that, as we've said a few times, that's not a criticism. I think that's just a portrayal of the process that human beings find themselves in at this time and have been for quite some time.
Yeah.
But going back to the actual experience of this album, though,
sure,
because we've been talking a lot about, I think, the philosophical implications of it.
But also, we almost can't talk about the personal experience until you get some of this stuff on the table, because that's the stuff that's kind of, you kind of have to carry. You kind of have to carry that awareness of that stuff as part of the conversation.
I agree with you, and I think that's why we spent so much. We've given it the time we have.
Yeah.
I think that for the most part, though, we're going to get deeper into the album's elements in the aftercast.
Yeah, I think and although we should not completely avoid it in this discussion, but no.
We are.
Where are we sitting on time?
An hour and 20.
Yeah. So yeah.
But we can. I think it would be good if we offer some of those up, our takes on the album.
Yeah. I'll say I'll offer something for sure.
Yeah.
What interests me most about this album and what I found most successful, and I do look forward to even unpacking that more intimately in the next discussion, but is that the personal theme of betrayal and infidelity, and how I watched that being processed in language. I whether that was a fictionalized account of something that happened to her or a fiction unto itself, which I leave the possibility open to.
Okay.
I don't have a lot of confidence that that Jay-Z was, this was I'm pretty sure something went down.
Okay.
So I don't think it's a complete fiction in any sense.
Right.
I think something happened. But whether, to what extent, I don't know. But I love that personal journey of working through that, because of course, like I said, I've got my own experience with that in the past, and I could identify with that narrative and that process. You talked about the 5 stages of grief, right?
Yeah, Kubler-Ross model.
Yeah, those are that is a theoretical or a model based on observing people going through stages of grief and coming up with classifications, because so that this follows that. It just speaks to its it's the sort of authenticity in quotes of the experience, the realness of that journey, and I found that incredibly compelling, particularly because of the contradictions that happen in those, right? And the sort of like the turning, so the up down of it.
Okay.
The happy, sad, mad, the wound, you can't hurt me, I'm hurt. Like that oscillation between
I don't need you, where are you?
I found that just very juicy and very touching to self. And I think I joked to you, we've mentioned now a couple of times that we've had a couple of conversations about this album, but we didn't really talk about this album.
We just clarified.
We clarified a couple of small things.
Yeah.
We still have not gotten together and discussed this.
No.
But I remember early on, I think I said something to you. It's like, my experience of listening to this album is the first time through was like, Jay-Z, you're in trouble, boy. Like, I was mad at Jay-Z. He became the projection of all my anger of my ex's affair partner or whoever. I was looking at Jay-Z like, you done messed up.
That's I appreciate your honesty about that.
Oh, I was not digging on Jay-Z. I was Team Beyonce suddenly, and it was like, 'cause I was Beyonce, right? Like I internalized that, and I looked at Jay-Z as the you dog, and I thought it'd be funny to take the my listens as I process different orientations of processing the story in my relationship to Jay-Z. So that when I start off, I'm just weeping, Jay, how could you, I'm wounded, I'm hurt. And then, I'm angry, and then I'm indignant, then I'm going through these things, and each one was going to be a projection against Jay-Z. And that was my initial idea of, how we were going to promote the podcast. Was that?
I remember you telling me about that, and I think I said something to the effect of, "Have a good time with that."
Yeah, I was just going to record myself responding to Jay-Z with every listen to see how it changed, but I didn't do that, thankfully. But but yeah, so I experienced it very personally, and was able to find my way through the songs and through the changing songs, still with some challenges because of just the different aesthetics of them and the
so you mean
sounds. Because
they're so different, you didn't feel that there was the cohesion from track to track was lost because of the change in palettes?
I was able to find my way back to it, so I found a through line through it. On the emotional side, and I looked at the disparateness of it,
right,
as kind of the noise that was going on, like almost like it equated to the same kind of noise that I had going on in my head when I was trying to process this kind of event in my life, back in the day. Not my current partner, my ex, by the way, everyone.
Okay.
So the fact that we were going from radically different sounds and spices and dishes was more reflective of just the sort of chaos and noise of experience. Like, it's almost like turning a channel the old school way, like through the dials where you could just go to different noise things. Well, that's how I felt in that moment, dealing with that as personal. Like the world around me was spinning there. And, but there is, at least I found, sort of that by identifying with the narrative and being Beyonce, or internalizing that experience for myself, that was my emotional through line through those.
Well, I too was, as I said before, the changes in the palettes from track to track. That was the thing that I actually felt gave the strongest ring of clarity that something did happen.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the lyrics are words give us this supposed concrete picture of things, but it was the concept and the selection of having different palettes from track to track, to me, said that she went through something.
Yeah.
That was actually the thing that spoke to me the strongest. It didn't even matter. I'm not even talking about what the palettes are or how effective they were or how they played out. Just the fact that this track and this track sound this way, right? Like there's this track is very rock. Mm-hmm. This track is just a piano and a vocal, you know. And this track is going to be in kind of like a Texas blues with like a New Orleans kind of, horn section and that, like, all those differences to me spoke of what you just said, is that something happened. The other thing about this album that shifted for me is when I watched the movie. The film is just like the album. There's 7 directors. So there's this pastiche of different ways that camera work is done, different lighting, different moods.
Yeah.
And then in the movie, none of the songs appear in their totality, if I remember it right. They're pretty much all snippets, so that the film just sits at just over an hour. And when I saw that film, I watched it just the one time, all the way through, and I saw that mixture, and I saw that mixture of visuals, and then hearing this poetry that was also utilized and put into the mix. It made me really connect for myself with the degree to her vision. Like, I felt that however it played out, she was all in with it. And that for me has a great deal of value. No matter how well I feel that it works or not, however it reaches me emotionally or not, when someone sees something through, that is very significant for me. And I cannot imagine what her life is like in every sense, besides the fact that she's a woman of color, the role that she plays and how people view her and all the elements of her life. I can't connect with that. But that she could see this through and have it be, like you mentioned, like all of these moving parts coming together. So it's the creator in me, right? Just acknowledging the creator. And when I say creator, I'm not referring to a concept of God. I'm just the creator in her, and any elements of what I saw or what I heard in terms of how they worked for me or how they didn't work for me is just kind of on the side.
Sure.
And to me, that also connects with demonstrating that it's important to put your life out there.
Yeah.
To show yourself, to reveal yourself. And I know that there's a lot of talk about this. People might not talk about it the way I'm about to express it, but to actually reveal yourself is already problematic. This is a little bit of my cosmology, because everyone, in my estimation, is pursuing or in the process of who am I? It evolves with you. So to put yourself, to show yourself, to reveal yourself, is such a beautiful aspect of being human that we would all benefit from, right? And I think that when I saw that film, I felt like I was seeing somebody really trying to make use of as many tools as they could to do that. Again, how well it's done and all of that is just on the side right now. So what that brings me back to is kind of what you were talking about earlier on, is that she's human, or she's having a human experience, and so am I. And so are you.
Right.
And so is Jay-Z. And so is all the people. And so what I'm depicting right now isn't about Beyonce.
Right. And
it's about what happens for me when I go through, often I go through a certain I go through a process, or I go through a period of time with other people's work. I come to places like that, in that I go to, I guess you could call it a state or a feeling of that ineffability of shared experience, or you could also say not shared experience.
Yeah. You said it earlier that, you don't know what Beyonce's life is like. Like you can hardly conceive of it. And certainly I agree with that. And, to the point I know there is a Beyonce and I can call her Beyonce. And right. I know there's a guy called Jay-Z that's married to Beyonce and I can call him Jay-Z. I don't know either of these people. But what I do know is that whoever they are human beings that experience human things. And so although I may, speak when I use her name, what's prime to me when I'm talking about the music is that especially, and the concept of this album is I'm using Beyonce, the human being, the person who had some sort of experience,
right.
Or created some sort of experience. I'm angry at Jay-Z. But Jay-Z's just a name. I'm right, angry at the dude.
Right. So what, one way to spin this is, what if Jay-Z had basically done something similar?
Yeah,
and had created an album and did a movie where he depicted what that was for him. Where would we be? But then we could also ask, maybe he's not able to because of however he feels about it, or maybe because it's in the context of the relationship, it's just not going to happen. We don't know. But the other thing I wanted to add about the album is the imagery that came to me about my experience of this album.
Okay.
So earlier on, I had said that my first listen, her vocals weren't grabbing me.
Yeah, you were.
Wasn't getting in there. And as I went on more listens, I actually came into cringe-worthy moments where I felt that her vocal was, I don't want to say that it wasn't authentic, but there was something that was just, now it was reaching me in a way that wasn't sitting in a place of connecting with her, other than to say, that doesn't quite feel right. And what I came to was that she can sing. No question. She can sing.
Yeah.
But there is a depth and mood in her voice that is lacking for me. I don't feel not that I have to feel the same as when I'm listening to Nina Simone, right, or Billie Holiday, okay, or Alanis Morissette, Jagged Little Pill, or PJ Harvey. But there is a depth that isn't happening for me. I don't hear the depth of her. I hear what she's saying.
Yeah.
I sometimes hear I'm hearing moods and feelings, but there's this deeper, I'm going to call it a deeper sense of self.
Yeah.
Even an ease, I would go so far as to call it that is not revealing itself. So after coming to that realization with this album, the image that I was left with is that this album to me feels like there are 2 or 3 candles that are lit, and they're in a context of neon. So I felt very much like there is a type of light that is sitting in a larger form of light, and they just don't work the same way. So maybe I should set it up this way. Every single album I believe that we talk about has a glow. It has a luminescence.
Okay.
It has a light.
Interesting. Yeah.
All right, then I'll continue.
Yeah.
It has a light.
Okay.
And I know how dangerously saccharine this could become, but they glow. It's just that the light's going to affect and reach everyone differently. The luminosity is going to be different, even for the people who made the album, for the cleaning people who clean the studios, for the producers, for everyone who's listening to the albums, for the people who actually press the vinyl. The let's call it the spine of the creation and dissemination of all these albums has a life force, has a glow. And so in my lifetime, many albums, that light has changed. You know, you can use a lot of different analogies for it. But so with this album for me right now, that image of a couple candles, but in just like a neon world or a neon context, there's a few ways that I could spin what that says for me, but it really helped me to settle into the issue with her, for me, with her voice, but then also how there were things about the album that were like a candle. Like I could put my hands to them and kind of get warmed by it, and I could take that light and I could pass it on. Because another way to spin it is that one of the big things that this album did, which is really funny to me, because when I think about, you know, the music industry and how it can be so, well, we talked about being recursive and, you know, self-repeating, is that all of a sudden people thought, oh yeah, you could do an album where all the tracks don't have the same instruments and they don't have the same feel. It's just like when, you know, Frank Sinatra made his first concept album, and everyone was like, people were like, oh, you can make a concept album? It's the same kind of thing. So there's a glow that comes from that. Because it moves around. You know, neon and candlelight don't move around the same way, right? A candle, you could light another candle. You can't light other neon with neon unless you plug it into the same grid and it's already neon. And of course, with a candle, you can start a fire. You can't, well, you could do that with neon, but that's a whole other chemical process. But that was the other thing that came up with the album, and I would love to open it up more in the aftercast. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of places we could go with it.
Absolutely. I'm not even really going to address that right now and respond to that because I think we definitely will save this for the aftercast.
Well, I think we're there.
Yeah, we are
at
there.
Our time.
I will say a couple of things. Beyonce fans, send your cards and letters and complaints and citations. Attention, Joël, in the subject heading, please. But yeah, I know what you're saying, and as a funny aside, I've got with the Morning Coffee Vinyl Sign project that I have on Instagram and YouTube. I did a little video and a write up on Barbra Streisand's. Barbra Streisand.
Okay, yeah.
Streisand. Yeah, it's first album. Barbra Streisand.
Yes.
First album. And I made some comments about what it is and isn't, and there's context there. You're welcome to go look it up and read it. But I will say I'm still getting emails daily from Barbra Streisand pardon me, Barbra Streisand fans taking umbrage with the fact that I dared suggest that there was any aesthetic need for improvement or that it wasn't perfection.
Right.
Like forget
So
about what
they wanted to know. They wanted you to know how they feel.
they wanted me to know how they feel. So I just found this is going to be fun. But to be fair, just that, joking aside, I know what you're saying, and I think it's going to be really interesting to kind of get into that a little more and talk about that, because you're not saying oh, she's a bad singer, or,
not at all
in any sense of the way. We're talking about the experience of something, and that experience is dynamic. So
and evolves.
So any little sentence is just a sentence in the moment, but there's a lot of depth behind that, and some stuff to explore there too. Because I do get what you're saying. There are some elements that also on this album had me sort of a little bit cringe on a couple of things. But I equated those to the way when you're trying to work through something, you put on different clothes.
Well, and that's why,
mirror, right?
Well, that's why I didn't want to open it up, because that's
yeah,
and that's why when I say cringeworthy, and I'm not hearing a depth in there, like there's a lot of places to go with that.
Yeah, and so I would encourage anyone that's really interested in this stuff, come with us over to the Aftercast. Yeah. And let's see where we go with this, because this, I think, is going to be a lot of fun.
And you can find the Aftercast episodes on our Patreon page under Sonic Ventures Podcast.
Yeah.
And as always, if you want to connect with us, you can connect with us through the Patreon page, but you can also do so through our email at sonicventurespodcast@gmail.com.
Right.
You can also find us on Instagram and on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And we also have a website, although people don't really frequent it all that much. But you can also contact us through there as well.
Yeah.
Again, Sonic Ventures Podcast.
Be happy to hear from anybody.
And I have to say that we have been very, very honored by the kinds of interactions we've had with people, because they have a lot to say.
Yeah.
And they, by and large, not only tell us what they think, but they tell us about themselves.
Yeah.
And often where they've been and what they've been through. And sometimes it relates directly to the album we're talking about. And sometimes it's just about how music's in their lives.
Yeah.
But I think both of us feel very pleased that we've been able to connect with people and have certainly not conversations to the same length as these ones, but ones that we feel are improving our lives.
Yeah. I feel very fortunate, and of course fortunate to be having these discussions with you, and fortunate to have my own life enriched through music and through friendship and people participating in our endeavor here. So very pleased with that.
So am I. And looking forward to continuing the Aftercast.
Sounds good, man. We'll talk soon.
Yeah.
Like in 30 seconds.